For you online people, keep your eyes out. I'm going to be posting a thing about a scholarship, even if for some bizarre reason you decide you're no longer interested in agriculture. That's okay, because the scholarship still we qualify based on where in the state we're located. It's put out by the Farm Credit, so you can get between $2,000 and $6,500. So I'll be posting that info in Blackboard sometime today.
Very nice.
Yep.
Thanks, Tom.
Yep. So otherwise, I'm done.
All right. Well, hope you all had a great Thanksgiving. I was able to work out what the problem was with the tests, and I've just learned that I cannot, for some reason, Respondus, the program that we use for tests, and what I was using for quizzes, just not uploading the test for me. So I went back into Blackboard and recreated it. It's up there, and it should be open now. So I'm going to say a week from today. I was going to open it, but I figured you guys would be busy over Thanksgiving and didn't necessarily want to study for and take a test. So consider that a Thanksgiving gift, or curse, perhaps. Anyway, the test is up now, week from today, until 11:59 p.m. on Monday. Again, you can use your materials. You can use the review sheets, whatever you need to use for the test. I did not put a time limit on it other than that 1 week. So no exceptions beyond a week from today. The test will close and you won't have access to it. So all right, well, we are moving on to the next unit, and we started a little bit last week on chapter 14, and we'll continue with that. So let me share my screen here. All right, you guys see that? Sure. Am I sharing the right screen? Okay. There we go. Can you see it? Yeah? Yeah, nay?
Yeah.
Say something. Yusuf, you're good?
I can see it.
Okay, thank you, sir. We're talking about soil conservation and protecting against erosion. So we're looking at the erosion factors, and we said that level land, of course, is less likely to erode from water or from wind than sloping land, but it still is vulnerable to some erosion, especially wind erosion. And best protection against wind being vegetative cover. And really the best protection for any type of erosion is just cover. Having a cover crop or a mulch in place, or just a crop or crop residue itself, can be good. Also, they mentioned in the book that leaving the soil surface somewhat rough. For instance, if you were preparing the soil and you did not actually disc or till, but you just plowed it, then it is less vulnerable to wind erosion. And of course, wind breaks can help too. And so why is that so important? Well, we'll take a look into the past here. Soil erosion began to become a huge issue as there was a lot of soil preparation, a lot of plowing, a lot of disking and tilling, especially in the Midwest. So in 1929, Congress actually started to establish some soil conservation experiment stations to see what was affecting soil erosion. And they began work, but it didn't really become extremely important until they call it Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935, which was one of the most devastating dust storms. This is kind of like in the middle of the Dust Bowl era, which I'm sure you've all heard of. But it was a result of this repeated soil preparation combined with drought and then some severe wind erosion occurring, which caused these dust storms. And of course, we don't have them here really. I mean, maybe in the driest years we might have some dust storms, but generally we see dust storms in the Midwest and Western states. However, there was this severe dust storm that actually completely blotted out the noonday sun in the Midwest. And that really promoted it. And it was actually slightly before that they actually created the Soil Conservation Service. But this is like kind of on the tail end of the Dust Bowl. And this happened over, about 7 years, they say 1928 to 1935, where it was just long period of drought, but farmers, did not really, they still needed to produce crops. They still tried to, so they continued to plow and prepare the soil to where it got so fine it was able to be picked up by the wind. And later on, this guy, Hugh Hammond Bennett, actually went to Congress and basically was pleading for, some sort of service to be created in addition to these agricultural experiment stations. And so they actually started the Soil Conservation Service in 1933. They're kind of in the middle of the Dust Bowl. And I don't know if this is true or not, but they say that when he was actually giving his address to Congress, this dust storm actually blew into Washington, D.C. So he was aided by the fact that this dust storm happened, and they had to believe him. And so they started the Soil Conservation Service, which today is known as the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And I just want to throw this out there while I'm talking about them. The NRCS is a federal agency administered through the USDA, and they have a lot of grant opportunities. If you all are landowners or someone in your family is a landowner, especially if you have like moving water on your land, you can actually apply for these grants. One of the big ones is called the EQIP, which is Environmental Quality Incentives Program. They will do a cost share program, pay for 80% for things like a hoop house, cover crops, fencing for livestock, planting trees for windbreaks. They do all kinds of stuff. It's a really good program, and it's definitely accessible. So I would recommend you visit your local NRCS office if you are a landowner and see if you can participate in one of those programs. We got a hoop house for like $800 through the program, so it was really a good deal. Anyway, moving on. This is something we actually looked at when we were doing our soil surveys, looking at conservation and through the land capability classes. Generally, you looked at this in that little lab, but it will basically say what the land is suitable for. And if it's too steep or whatever, if the soil is too loose, then they will advocate for, not doing any kind of agriculture and just leaving it for, game, for instance, or some kind of recreation. So different soil conservation methods depending on different types of landscapes, right? Whether the topography is gentle or steep, what the soil type is itself, what kind of cropping you're thinking of doing, if you have livestock, what the climate is. But we want to keep in mind that we want to only use land that is actually suitable for agriculture. So let's look at some of these methods of soil conservation they've outlined here for us. One of them is known as grass waterways, and this is kind of used in conjunction with several different conservation methods, practices, but basically it's leaving an area covered in some type of vegetation to where, and depending on how much land is draining into that area, but something that can actually conduct the water and infiltrate it into the soil rather than having it run off. So you'll see this sometimes. These grass waterways are basically just land strips in between crops. And as you can kind of see in the picture here, it's draining off from the steeper areas down into the waterway. And you can kind of see a little riparian corridor there in the background, probably what the waterway itself is draining into. Contour tillage is something that I think is not used enough, but is actually, especially with today's technology, pretty easy to do. Tractors today can incorporate GIS and GPS and actually till exactly on contour. And if you think about a contour, looking at like a topographic map, the contour lines on the map, kind of like the concentric circles, if you will, showing how steep an area is. That's your contour. That's the area where it drops by whatever measure. Most topographic maps, we're looking at, like 100 feet, but it could be as little as 1 foot or even several inches. But the idea here, and as you can see in this image, they are not only tilled and plowed and tilled and the land prepared on contour, but also planted on contour, so that as water flows, it will basically hit each contour and spread throughout that entire range. It actually keeps your crops a lot more consistent as well. And the basis here is that these little ridges that are almost like little miniature raised beds left by the whatever tillage you do actually act as like a little small dam to spread and percolate that water into the soil rather than allowing it to run off and cause erosion. Now this is kind of alternate, for contour tillage. It's more looking at the preparation. This is more looking at the planting itself, actually doing contour strip cropping. So having an area, whatever crop it is and however much area it is, on contour, on a slope, basically. So in this case, it's kind of combined with those, grass waterways in between. But we've got these strips of crops in between solid planted, things like sod or a cover crop, whatever. We mentioned terracing last week, and terracing can be on a small scale or on a large scale. Generally, it's a little bit more intensive, requires a little bit more energy to do, and can be a little bit more impactful on the land itself. One of the big things on terracing is that generally you need something like for it to drain into. And again, we usually use kind of these grass waterways so that any excess water flows out into some sort of outlet. I've also mentioned low and no-till agriculture too, which has become huge, and especially in the Midwest. Rather than plowing, disking, and cultivating every year, they use herbicides to kill vegetation, and then they leave the vegetation in place. They might use implements to break up that vegetation, but they don't actually remove the vegetation, just keeping that crop residue there. And whatever you're planting, they actually use like a shallow chisel plow or a seed drill, or also a transplanting kind of drill, in order to plant through that crop residue. So in this way, you're basically not disturbing the soil very much at all, and really preventing any erosion potential. All right, moving on away from conservation and talking about just what I prefer to call substrate, but what the book calls artificial soils or media. And there's all kinds of different descriptions for these things, such as artificial media or potting soil or soilless mixes, container mixes, whatever. It's all a substrate. It's something that you're growing crops in. And usually these are used more for like greenhouse production or maybe some small scale agriculture. But some of these artificial soils can actually be used in particular landscape situations as well, like construction sites, on golf courses, and at athletic fields that have to have really high drainage. And basically when we're looking at these artificial soils, these substrates, we look at the same factors that influence our native soils are influencing these different mixes and the different components that we might use in a mix. The different cation exchange capacities, for instance, so the different drainage, different textures, etc. So this substrate can contain all kinds of different components, and here's just a few pictured. But some of the more common components include things like compost, which might be listed as organic matter, sand, not like a beach sand, but like a coarse sand. Peat moss is the most common. There's also a coconut husk called coir that is used. Also vermiculite, perlite that is pictured there in A. B here is type of, that's actually peat moss, I've got that backwards. And C is the calcined clay that is often used. We also use tree bark too in many of these mixes. And there's all kinds of different mixes out there. We've seen styrofoam in there. There's all kinds of different components that they put into them. They all have different properties. So it's important to look at these different components and what they are and how they affect the ability to use that soil. Generally, we don't use any native soil in greenhouse production, mostly because it's so heavy. It would require a lot more labor to move it. The containers that we use are not designed for that much weight either. And generally, it does not drain as well as these substrate mixes that are out on the market. So here are just some of the components and some of the reasons that they use these different components. Sand to make better drainage and to create larger pore spaces. Vermiculite holds water and actually has a pretty good cation exchange capacity. Peat moss, most commonly used partially for its nutrient holding capacity, but it also generally makes a little bit of a lower pH. It's used mostly because it is the widest available component of most substrates. Generally, they also contain a little bit of a fertilizer too. And if you all use potting soil for whatever indoor plants or in greenhouse production, it's just enough to really start plants. You still have to fertilize. There are some mixes out there that say that they will feed plants, for a certain period of time. But I think it's still important to have a fertilizer plan in place too. Let's talk about water management and touch a little bit here on irrigation. It's really interesting to think about that irrigation has been used for a really long time. I mean, we're talking about over 4,000 years. We have evidence of irrigation being used. And really in parts of the world that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Even in the Southwest here in the United States, they were using irrigation pretty early on. When they didn't really have developed much technology, they knew that they needed to have water to grow crops. So that's the deal. I mean, we use irrigation anywhere where there isn't sufficient natural rainfall, or maybe when there is not sufficient natural rainfall in the right season. For instance, if you go to Oregon, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, you think of it as being pretty rainy, right? Well, it is in the winter, but in the summer, there's really not that much precipitation, so they have to irrigate. Even though they have tons of water there, it's just not in the right time. So many different ways that they began to use irrigation early on, including just the building and removal of small dams. Whenever we're looking at irrigation, it's really important to look at the quality of the water as well as the quantity of water itself. Really, I mean, you can have as much water to use for your crop as you need, but if it's not of a good quality, then it's really not worth it. So one of the things we might look at, chemical property, is the pH of water supply, which in turn affects the soil's pH. Natural rainfall is actually slightly acidic, and that's why, over time we start to get slightly more acidic soils. So generally, especially in older soils, we have to kind of buffer that by often using like lime, for instance. So really, this is incorrect here. It says alkalinity is the ability of water to resist the change in pH. It is determined by the amount of carbonates in the water, but the correct term there is buffering, is the ability of water to resist the change in pH. Oh, there we go. Greater the resistance, the buffering capacity of water. So let's look at different methods of applying water through irrigation. Of course, the factors that determine that, what the climate is, what the type of crop is, the physical properties of the soil itself, as well as the topography of the lay of the land, cost of water, again, the quality of the water, and the availability and drainage capability of the soil. So cost is a big thing, right? And you should really examine that. We actually have an organic grower here in our county who's been pretty successful, but I always thought it was kind of, I don't know, kind of weird because he uses municipal water. He uses county water to water his crops, which makes it extremely expensive to produce his crops. But also, our municipal water is really high in lime, for instance, because it's flowing through limestone. So it's hard water. There's lots of soluble salts in it. There's chlorine and fluoride as well, which in general on their own, especially in larger amounts, are not good for crops. So it's kind of like, well, is that really organic if you're using municipal water? But that might just be me. So let's look at some different irrigation methods here. We got flood irrigation, where you basically just flood the whole field. And generally this only occurs where the topography is flat and level. You do need to actually grade the soil, though. It has to slope a little bit. If the water just sits there on level and doesn't drain out at all, then that can be bad for your crops. So an alternative here for flood irrigation is furrow irrigation, and it's often also called flood and furrow irrigation, where basically we have raised beds and they're using canals to flood the field, but only the furrows themselves. And it's actually better because you're not actually flooding the crops themselves. You're just flooding the ditches in between. And think about this, especially looking at this picture, thinking about our latest E. coli outbreak in romaine lettuce there. There's a lot of safety issues associated with irrigation, and most of those are actually caused by irrigation, contamination of your irrigation water. So, and forgive me, this is probably going to sound kind of bad, but I got to say it. A lot of these operations, especially, in like California, for instance, where there's tons and tons of agriculture taking place, we have lots of migrant labor, and they might not be used to indoor plumbing as much. So they might go use the bathroom in a furrow, and then in this case, if it's flooded, then that ends up spreading those contaminants throughout the entire crop potentially. So that's what they found in a lot of cases. They've traced back. E. coli is a natural living bacteria in our intestines. So, it doesn't harm us there, but when it's out of our intestines and elsewhere, then it does harm us. And that's usually where E. coli poisoning comes from. So anybody ever had food poisoning? Well, if you have, then you probably don't want to think about what caused it. But
were you following the romaine lettuce E. coli outbreak last week?
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that that's going to come back to that same thing. Basically, a worker probably contaminated the water, and they probably flooded the field, or even in overhead irrigation too, you can get those contaminants. So, yeah, how many deaths were caused from that so far anyway?
I haven't heard, but because I know they did a pretty quick job of pulling all the lettuce off of the store shelves and restaurants.
The problem is, they can't test everything. Everything that goes out there. Fortunately, they did test one thing, and it came back. I don't know if that was as a result of food poisoning. They go back and test or what, but nonetheless, it's a big deal. I mean, we have an E. coli outbreak, multiple times every year, right? So, all right. So here's just a picture of furrow irrigation. It's more efficient than flooding, of course, because the entire surface is not wet and less food safety issues too. And there's reduced evaporation losses. You have to look at the depth of the furrow, of course, and how high the raised bed is to try to avoid actually wetting the crop itself. Here's kind of a modification of that system used in greenhouses. This is called ebb and flood irrigation. And they do this either on benches, like in this picture, or also on floors as well. So in this case, they got a concrete floor. They flood that entire floor and then drain it off. And really, it's a good thing to use. Subsurface irrigation is what we call it. And there's many different ways to apply this. But the plant almost can kind of control how much water it's taking up. You have more efficient use of fertilizers because not all lost. You don't have as much runoff. Also, you don't get the actual plant wet itself, which in some cases it's good to get the plant wet. You want to get the surface of the plant wet to cool it down, right? Like transpiration does. But also, whenever you have wet leaf surfaces, generally causes disease issues. So this is a way to kind of get around that through subsurface irrigation. Overhead irrigation is also often used, but there are different nozzles, there's different flow rates and spray patterns that allow overhead forms of irrigation to be adaptable to different situations. Overhead is probably the most often used form of irrigation, and usually it's really used especially in establishing crops to make seed germination more uniform. It uses less total water than like flood or furrow irrigation, and it can be effective in kind of flushing soils, taking those salts out. Sometimes we actually even use overhead irrigation for frost control in spring and fall. However, of course, there's a lot of infrastructure involved, which causes equipment and energy costs to be higher. Also could cause labor costs to be higher as well. And depending on the quality of the water itself, you can also plug overhead nozzles with sediment. So here's just one type of overhead sprinkler system used in a greenhouse. We've got risers that are spaced along these lateral pipes that are pressurized and get the sprinklers to actually, move and react without necessarily energy being, used to move them. You can actually do it through a gravity feed if you have a high enough gradient too. Here's just pictured some, especially out west, you guys have probably seen these if you've been out there. The wheel line systems where basically they have these wheels propelled by gas engines that are, using a sprinkler, still overhead irrigation. Pretty cool. And here's one used in a greenhouse, and this is kind of like a boom type overhead irrigation. You kind of see that bar with the different sprinklers on it, mounted and moved overhead. And they call that, what they're moving it on is also called a gantry, this track that runs the length of the greenhouse. And here's a close-up of one of these sprinklers itself. Through varying the nozzle type itself and the gantry speed, you can use it to adapt to many different types of crops, which makes it, useful in greenhouse settings. Another form of overhead that if you've flown over the Midwest or Western states, you've seen this. If you look out your window, you see center pivot system being used often where the land values or labor availability is low. And basically, if you look, let's see if I can zoom in a little bit here. Kind of look at this image here, that the crops are planted kind of in this circular manner, and this pivot system runs throughout this, basically to irrigate it throughout the circular path. So one big issue with overhead forms of irrigation is that they are prone to losses of water due to a lot of evaporation. You're not wetting the soil here, you're wetting the plant itself, and then it must actually channel the water to the soil. We can have some water uptake through leaves, but it's minimal. It's mostly reducing the loss of water. So it's better to think about applying water to the soil rather than to the plant itself. So newer systems, you can kind of see in this one, they've actually developed them to emit the water closer to the canopy to try to, prevent some loss of water, which can be a big deal if there's not, good amount of water already naturally occurring. Finally, drip irrigation is one of the, probably the most precise form of irrigation. And in this case, really, you're not watering the plant itself, you're watering the soil. So you don't get any runoff, and you don't get really any evaporation losses either. So it's just this slow little drip, and we have these different emitters that are put into the pipes at different levels to basically give however much water the emitter will allow you. So they have like, half a gallon per hour emitters, 1 gallon per hour, and so on and so forth. They also have some irrigation lines that are just set at row spacing. They don't actually have emitters, that stick out. The emitters are right in the line itself. So drip is probably the most efficient system. It can be left in place doesn't have much interference with other agricultural operations. There's less fluctuation of the soil moisture in the root zone area, and there's less water needed to grow a crop. However, it does have its downsides too. Often you need expensive filtration equipment in order to actually avoid clogged emitters, which happens quite a bit, even with filtration systems. Your water distribution may be uneven, especially if you have some topography in a field. Also, it tends to concentrate salts, which the concentration of salts can actually clog the emitters themselves, but also you don't get the leaching that you do with like overhead irrigation. It also might cause root zones to be somewhat restricted so that you're not actually getting, as resilient of a crop to drought. Here's one way that they're starting to control irrigation. We've really gotten to the point where we're starting to get really precise with water application. And in some cases, they make self-correcting systems using things like these tensiometers here to actually measure the soil moisture and schedule irrigation. And in a greenhouse system, we often have them controlled by computer systems, which might take into account the humidity, the actual pressure of the soil itself, the soil moisture, and its evaporation potential too. So lots of things that can be done there. I do want to point out though on the drip thing, this is kind of an interesting thing. I'm just going to go back here just for a second. Sorry, forgive me here, but we visited a farm in Oregon where basically they switched from overhead to drip, and they were pretty high up on the watershed, so they were taking water they stored in a pond, and they were using that to power their sprinklers below. They found when they switched to drip, though, that their neighbors lower down on the watershed weren't getting the flow of water because it wasn't recharging the actual aquifer. You weren't getting any runoff. It was just giving the amount of water needed for the crop. So in some cases, they were actually, impacting their neighbors. So they switched back to overhead. That's kind of an interesting thing that could happen with drip. All right, let's talk about drainage for a second. Many of our, productive areas, like we have an area nearby called Shady Valley, which was actually just this spot kind of up on the mountain that was once almost a pure cranberry bog. Army Corps of Engineers went in there and drained it to make a more agriculturally productive area. In that case, you have lots of organic matter. You have really good soils in those cases. So we've actually increased drainage in some areas in order to provide better agriculturally productive areas. And we often do that through things like clay tiles or perforated plastic or ADS pipe buried underground to put in drainage. Of course, there is a consequence of that wetlands are very critical for many different ecosystems. So without the wetlands, we might have other problems. And of course, today where there's a lot of money and labor going in to try to restore and preserve wetlands. And there are some drainage systems now that are available that allow the wetlands to function, but still allow you to practice some agriculture as well. All right, let's move on to fertility management just for a minute. Looking at fertilizers, and really we say that it's synthetic fertilizers that have probably increased crop yields and reduced hunger more than any other single agricultural practice. And that was a big thing, especially in the Green Revolution in the 60s, where following World War II, they were able to use a lot of these things that they were using in bombs to actually used for fertilizers. So there was a period of time where there was a huge increase in fertilizer use. The downside of that is that if not used properly in conjunction with a good fertility plan, we have fertilizers run off, and that can pollute, wetlands, can pollute different waterways, and also, do some damage to our soils as well. So we have to look at trying to maintain and improve soil fertility very precisely. Generally, what we need to look at is a balance. We need to think about how much our crops need and how much we're actually removing through crop harvest. Because basically we're exporting nutrients whenever we harvest our crops. So we have to put that same amount of nutrients back in pretty much that we lost. But no more, because if we have more than enough, then it runs off and pollutes other ecosystems. Our commercial kind of synthetic fertilizers that are, again, bound to these salts are easy to apply and easy to manage, especially when comparing them to things like manures or crop residues. But they're not the be-all, end-all of fertilizers either. So one of the big benefits that we get from other fertilizers, adding organic matter and actually improving the soil structure itself. And in many cases, using manure, for instance, will increase organic matter, but also reduce its impact because otherwise it would have been a pollutant. And go back thinking about water pollution. The two number one pollutants of waterways are usually from agriculture. Number one being sediment, soil sediment actually running off into waterways, and the second being nitrogen runoff, again, from fertilizers, over-fertilization. For most field crops, we actually do a kind of pre-plant or fertilization during planting. We often need additional applications later on in the season, especially when crops get to flowering and fruiting, and they need more nutrients. They have that period of lots of growth in a short period of time. If we have more frequent applications of fertilizer, generally we have a lower concentration of the nutrients supplied at each application. And again, over-application and the misuse of fertilizers can pollute water, basically. We already touched on this, but looking at fertilizers, and especially the commercial fertilizers, we'll always see NPK listed as the numbers, referring to our three primary macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And that's expressed as a percentage. So it's the percentage of that primary nutrient based on a whole. So if you have a 100-pound bag of fertilizer and it's a 10-10-10, then you've got 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, 10% potassium. However, that doesn't say anything about where it's coming from. And they don't have to in many cases. So it doesn't say what compounds are used to actually make up the fertilizer. Knowing those formulations can actually allow us to make better decisions about how to apply the fertilizers. We need to look at the physical properties, what they're bound to, whether it's a salt, for instance. In some cases, they can get really lumpy or caked together, which causes it to be difficult to apply, and that's basically just from it absorbing moisture out of the air. Another interesting issue they point out here is ammonium nitrate is explosive, and probably many of you are too young for this, but the Oklahoma City bombing that was a huge deal, Timothy McVeigh, I'm sure you've heard of that at some point, was due to this explosive capability of ammonium nitrate, and it actually cause people to register large purchases of this type of fertilizer. Kind of crazy. And we talked about plant requirements and plant nutrition. Of course, all plants are different. You have to look at a fertilization program, in comparison to the crop itself, what its needs are, as well as testing your soil or growing media, and in some cases doing tissue testing as well. So those are things that should be looked at as part of a fertilization program. And also, as we mentioned, the availability of many of our plant nutrients is regulated by pH. And really the big thing to know here is that for the widest variety of nutrients and the best balance, we want a pH around neutral. What many people call a sweet soil. Now, there might be other reasons to do have more acidic or alkaline soils, depending on each particular crop. But for the widest range, around 6 to 7 is really the best. So we can adjust pH, of course. For acidic soils, we usually use lime or calcium carbonate, CaCO3, to raise the pH. To lower the pH, we use things that form acids in the soils, usually with sulfur in them. So sulfurs and sulfates to lower pH, limes and calcium to raise pH. And here's just an image of the table showing that, what I was saying. If you look, this is like 7 right here in the center. Notice that it has the greatest overlap of all of the nutrients here and the greatest range available. Notice that iron actually is a little bit more available at acidic levels. Boron has this weird kind of thing where it's, available at some acidic or some alkaline, but for the greatest overlap of all of our essential elements, it's right around neutral. We talked about cation exchange capacity when we were talking about soil properties. One of the big things that you need to know in terms of increasing cation exchange capacity is that we mostly do it through adding organic matter. You can add clay too, but that's not really very practical. So organic matter is generally the best way to increase cation exchange capacity for soils and for the best nutrition. However, in some particular situations, like in hydroponic systems, you might actually want a growing media with little or no cation exchange capacity because you're constantly supplying the nutrients through the water that you're giving your crops. Many different ways to actually supply the nutrients to plants. Well, really, there's only one way in which the nutrients are actually supplied, and that's through the soil solution, the water moving to it. But we can actually inject those nutrients into the soil through gases, also through solids and liquids. Our solids could be actual organic matter, different powders and dusts, pelletized fertilizers. Liquids are often water soluble and can be added in there into water or added as a liquid formulation. Some of these nutrients, though, are not actually soluble in water. So for iron, for instance, we have to go through a chelation process where basically that soluble molecule is attached to a different nutrient to improve solubility. One last thing here, looking at fertigation is basically just the application of a soluble fertilizer in irrigation water. Very often used in more intensive cultivation situations like greenhouses, landscapes, etc. And when we use these, we have to use a fertilizer injector in order to get those nutrients into the actual irrigation water itself. And that's that for chapter 14. Don't have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right. Well, somebody log in and try to get onto the test as soon as possible, just to make sure that it is actually working.
Oh my.
It looks good.
Alrighty then. Okay. Bye everybody. See y'all Wednesday, or we'll see you Wednesday, Ben.
Have a good Monday.
Oh yes. How can I not?